My family lived in a tired old apartment block with 8 floors and a stairwell that always smelled faintly of damp concrete. People said it had been built on top of something that shouldn't have been disturbed, an old shrine, a small temple, a place where incense used to burn day and night. Most of the neighbors treated it like a ghost story you tell kids to keep them from playing too close to the foundation. My mother didn't believe any of it. When I was 10, my parents finally had enough money to fix the apartment. Not a full renovation, just fresh paint, new tiles, a better-looking floor. My mother was proud of it in the way only someone who grew up with nothing can be proud. Every clean line, every bright corner, proof that life was getting better. The workers finished laying the new tiles on a Friday. On Saturday morning, my mother found 3 tiles near the center of the living room, slightly raised, like bubbles under skin. She stared at them for a long time, then crouched down and knocked with her knuckles. The sound was wrong, hollow in a way the rest of the floor wasn't. "That's poor workmanship," she said. She called the crew back, furious. They pried the tiles up, re-leveled the bed, and swore they'd fixed it. The next morning, the same 3 tiles were lifted again, same spot, same subtle curve, like something underneath had exhaled. The foreman looked confused and annoyed, and my mother's anger took over. She told them to leave. She said she'd do it herself if she had to. That afternoon, she borrowed tools and peeled the tiles up with a stubbornness that made my father tense. She didn't find any pipes, no loose concrete, no water damage, just a thin, dark seam in the slab where the tile bed had cracked, running in a shape that didn't match any structural line. Too smooth, too deliberate, as if it had been drawn. She scoffed, mixed fresh mortar, pressed the tiles back down, and stood on them with all her weight. She stomped, once, twice, 3 times, like she was daring the floor to argue. When she stepped off, she laughed. "See, it's fine." After that, the tiles stayed flat. The renovation ended. The apartment looked new. The walls were bright, the floor shone, friends came over and admired it, and my mother walked them through every detail like she was showing off a trophy. Then, less than a week later, she fainted in the bathroom. It was sudden. 1 minute she was brushing her hair. The next, I heard the dull sound of her body hitting the tile. My father rushed her to the clinic. The doctor called it exhaustion, a minor infection, nothing serious. He gave her pills, told her to rest, and sent us home. But the rest didn't help. My mother began to shrink. That's the only word that fits. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. She just looked tired, then thinner, then hollowed out. She stopped wanting food. She could barely swallow soup. Her eyes didn't track things properly, like part of her attention was aimed somewhere else. We went to larger hospitals. They ran more tests. They said the same things. A viral illness, some inflammation, nothing that explained how quickly she was disappearing. Every answer sounded calm. Every answer sounded wrong. My father kept repeating, "It's just a sickness," as if saying it enough times could make it true. My aunt didn't argue with him. She just watched my mother breathe, shallow, uneven, and she started making phone calls at night when she thought no one could hear. She was religious, my aunt, the kind of person who didn't say ghost or curse, only something not clean. She asked to see my mother's birth details, and when my father refused, she took them from a drawer when he wasn't home. She went to someone first, a man in a storefront that sold charms and incense. When she returned, she looked like she'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. "He won't touch it," she whispered to my father. "He said she's been marked." My father snapped. "Marked by what? Don't start this nonsense." My aunt flinched and didn't answer, not directly. That night she went again, this time to someone the first man had mentioned with fear, his teacher, an older woman who lived outside town in a tiny building locals still called a temple, even though it barely looked like one anymore. The roof sagged. The paint was worn. There were no tourists, just an old bell that didn't ring unless the wind hit it a certain way. The woman came to our apartment 3 days later. She was younger than I expected. Not elderly, not frail, just sharp-eyed, tired-looking, like someone who never slept properly. She stepped inside and didn't look at the walls or the furniture. She stared straight at the floor. Then she walked to the center of the living room, to the exact place where my mother had fixed the tiles. She didn't kneel. She didn't touch them. She simply stood there, listening. After a long moment, she said, "Who stepped here?" My father blinked. "What?" She repeated the question slower. Who put their weight on this spot? My aunt's hand flew to her mouth. My father glanced at my mother's bedroom door. His voice dropped. My wife. She fixed the tiles herself. The woman closed her eyes as if she'd expected that answer. She didn't just fix tiles, she said. She pressed herself into a place that was never meant to be pressed. She announced herself. My father looked angry and confused at the same time. Announced herself to what? The woman finally looked up at him. Something that doesn't want to be covered, she said. She didn't explain further. Instead, she pulled out thin yellow papers covered in dense writing, folded them with precise hands, and handed them to my aunt. One goes inside the front door, she said, one outside the bedroom, one under her pillow. The woman cut him off without raising her voice. You asked for help, she said. Do you want it or not? My father went silent. That first night after the papers went up, my mother woke fully for the first time in weeks. I was lying beside her because she couldn't be left alone. I remember the clock on the wall. It was a few minutes after 9. My mother's eyes opened suddenly, wide and bright in a way they hadn't been for a long time. She turned her head to look at me, and for one impossible moment, I felt a relief so strong it hurt. Then she smiled. It wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too certain, like someone wearing her face had learned how to pull it into the right shape. She started laughing, quiet at first, then sharper, faster, like a string being tightened. I whispered, Mom? She didn't blink. Her gaze held mine like a hook. I reached for her hand, and she grabbed my wrist with a strength that didn't belong in her thin body. Her fingers were cold and dry. The pressure was shocking. Her nails bit into my skin. I cried out. The living room was right outside our door. My father was watching TV. I could see the light flickering through the crack. He didn't move. It wasn't that he didn't hear me. It was worse. It was like the sound didn't exist outside the bedroom, like the room had folded in and taken my voice with it. I yanked my arm free with panic strength and ran into the living room, sobbing so hard I couldn't speak. Only then did my father notice me. What happened? He demanded, already irritated, already ready to dismiss it. I dragged him back to the bedroom. My mother was asleep again, peaceful, still, like nothing had happened. My father stared, ready to blame me. Then my mother's eyes fluttered open, and she sighed like someone returning from deep water. I'm hungry, she said softly. Can you make porridge? My father froze. His anger evaporated into hope so quickly, it looked like fear. The next day, relatives came. Everyone wanted to see her. Everyone wanted to believe she was improving. My mother, still weak but clearer, told them about her dreams. She said she'd been walking for days through empty land, digging with her bare hands because she was searching for something she couldn't name. She said every time she dug, she found old broken stones, rotted wood, things that made her sick with dread even in the dream. She said she kept hearing voices telling her, not here, over there. She dug until her fingers were raw. She dug until she couldn't feel her hands. She said the ground gave way in places, revealing pits that were already full of things that should have stayed hidden. And then, the night before she'd woken laughing, she'd finally understood where she was. A field of scattered graves, not marked, not respected. A place where the dead lay without names. And what she had been searching for, what she had been compelled to uncover, was her own. My own place, she said, eyes wide, voice cracking. My own hole, like it was waiting. The room went quiet. Even my father stopped pretending. After that, my aunt didn't have to argue anymore. The apartment filled with strange preparations. Bundles wrapped in red cloth. Paper figures the height of my knee. Paper animals with stiff legs. 2 roosters kept in a crate by the entrance, restless and loud in the mornings. A strip of white fabric was hung across the inside of the doorway like a warning. My father hated the white fabric. He said it looked like grief. My aunt told him it would stay until the day everything ended, one way or another. My mother had good days and bad days. On the good days, she could sit up and drink warm broth. On the bad days, she stared at the ceiling like she was listening for footsteps. The dreams changed. She said she was walking through fog on a narrow road, and her wrists and ankles were wrapped in heavy iron. She said the chain pulled forward, and at the other end were 2 thin figures holding her like an animal on a leash. When she stopped, one of them struck her with something that sounded like wind snapping. Move, they said, but she couldn't understand their voices properly, like the words were being spoken through water. She said she realized with a sick certainty that she was being led somewhere she wouldn't return from. Then, in that dream, two figures descended from above, one older, one smaller, both dressed like travelers from another century. The older one didn't fight. He simply looked at the chain as if it was an insult. The chain broke. My mother said she didn't remember being carried. She remembered only the feeling of rising, like the world below had lost its grip. When she woke from that dream, she cried for an hour and couldn't explain why. She only said again and again, "Someone pulled me back." She relapsed suddenly. Fever. Burning heat. Her skin flushed and dry. The hospital tried the usual things and failed. They told us to take her home, like the building itself was more honest than modern medicine. My aunt called the woman in the temple. The woman didn't come. She gave instructions over the phone. Cut 2 human shapes from red paper. Burn them at the bedside. Don't stop until the last corner curls into ash. My aunt did it. The apartment filled with the smell of smoke and something sharper underneath it, like scorched metal. My mother's fever eased. She woke sweating and trembling and said, "They were pulling me again." This time she said she'd seen 2 faceless figures. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth blank heads. She said each one gripped one of her arms and pulled in opposite directions as if trying to tear her in half. And both demanded something from her that she couldn't understand. The worst part wasn't the violence of the dream. It was the certainty that it wasn't only a dream. 3 days before the ritual, people I didn't know arrived at our apartment, carrying bags and boxes. My father was pale and obedient around them, like he'd stepped into a world where he didn't know the rules anymore. No one hid anything from me because I was a child. They assumed I didn't understand. That's how I learned what the woman in the temple believed had happened. They said my mother had been chosen as a replacement, not for death, for something older than that, for a place, for a role. They said that when my mother pried up the tiles herself and stomped them down, she had disturbed a point that acted like a seal, not on purpose, not out of malice, but in that world, intention didn't matter as much as contact. They said something below had noticed her weight, her warmth, her claim, and now it was trying to bring her back down. Someone asked in a voice that still wanted logic, "If it's holy, why would it do this?" One of the helpers answered quietly, "Holy doesn't always mean gentle, and sometimes it isn't the one on the altar that acts. It's what stands beside it." Then they spoke about an exchange, a substitute, a life to replace a life, because nothing was taken for free. My father didn't ask where the substitute would come from, or maybe he asked and didn't like the answer. I only remember the way his hand shook when he signed whatever they put in front of him. The night they performed the ritual, they began at an hour when the city felt asleep, when even distant traffic sounded far away. The apartment lights were dimmed. The curtains were drawn. The hallway outside our door was silent because my aunt had gone door to door, offering small gifts and asking the neighbors not to come out if they heard strange sounds. Our living room was rearranged into something that looked like a meeting and a funeral at the same time. Chairs were placed in rows. Families sat with their backs straight. Everyone held a long strip of white cloth that ran through all of our hands, so no one could let go without being noticed. The red-wrapped items were set against the southern wall. The paper figures stood like small witnesses in corners. The roosters at the door grew quiet, as if they sensed something. The woman from the temple arrived with a younger assistant. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't waste words. She walked to the center of the living room, to the repaired tiles, and stood there again. This time she nodded as if confirming something. Then she began. I won't describe everything, not because it was too graphic, but because even years later I can't remember it in a straight line. It was chanting and smoke, and the sense of a boundary being drawn inside a normal home. At one point, the woman took the strip of white cloth from our hands and held it up like a banner. The assistant did something at the doorway, and the roosters made a sound I'd never heard from an animal before. Raw and frantic. The cloth was stained. The woman kept chanting. Then she set the cloth on fire. It should not have burned. It was heavy and damp and marked. But it did. It burned cleanly as if the flame was hungry for it. The light it cast was wrong. It made the walls look farther away. It made the ceiling seem higher. It made the corners of the room look crowded, as if things were standing there, watching and waiting their turn. The woman's voice rose, then stopped abruptly. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. "It's done," she said. My aunt cried first, then my father, quietly, like he didn't know he was making noise. They took everything away before sunrise. The paper figures, the offerings, the ashes. Some of it was burned at a crossroads. Some of it was sealed in a jar and buried somewhere no one told me about. My mother recovered slowly, like someone returning from a long trip. First her appetite, then her color, then her laughter, her real laughter. The apartment stayed almost the same. The blood-like specks on the wall were scrubbed but never fully vanished. New talismans were placed in corners. The white fabric at the door was removed, but the nail holes remained. A month later, when my mother was strong enough to sit in the living room again, she told me she'd had one final dream. She said the faceless figures returned, but this time they were carrying something wrapped like a gift. She said they were pleased. She said they left without pulling at her, without touching her, like someone who had finally been paid. I asked her what the gift was. She shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just know it wasn't me." Years passed. We moved out when I was older. My parents never talked about that apartment again, unless someone forced the story out of them at a family gathering. But one thing stayed with me. On the day we left, my mother stood barefoot on the old living room floor, on those same tiles, and she didn't step on the center. She walked around it, careful, almost respectful. As she locked the door behind us, she said something so softly I almost didn't hear. It wasn't angry at the workers, she said. It was angry at me. "Why you?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. "Because I pressed back," she said, and it thought that meant I was claiming something. We went down the stairwell. The air grew warmer with each floor. The city noise returned at street level like a spell breaking. And right before we stepped outside, my mother paused and glanced back up the stairs as if expecting to see someone watching. There was no one, but the light above the second-floor landing flickered once, then twice, then 3 times. My mother didn't run. She took my hand, walked forward, and didn't look back.